Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. As we head towards the end of year set of PC game releases, I think it's time to talk about something that has been bugging me for some time: the ultra quality settings offered in the majority of AAA titles. Everyone wants to play the latest games using ultra settings. Everyone wants to crank stuff up to the max and buy graphics cards that can do this. But what we've discovered after testing many games in our time at Hardware Unboxed is that ultra settings are actually pretty dumb. By that I mean ultra settings often only provide a very small visual upgrade over high settings at a large cost to performance, which makes them not really worth using in a lot of cases. Don't get me wrong, I love a stunning visual experience, but the truth is that ultra settings tend to only make small changes over lower presets, and if you give high settings a chance, you may actually find the experience preferable and a better balance in the visual quality to performance stakes. So today we're going to look at the real world differences between ultra and high settings in a range of games, both in terms of visuals and performance, to see why you perhaps shouldn't automatically choose ultra settings in today's games or in upcoming games. In a climate where GPU upgrades are ridiculously expensive and hard to come by, this info might give some relief to gamers looking to optimize their setup. You might not need to buy that new GPU to still enjoy a great visual experience in these titles. For today's testing, we're using a fairly typical high-end test system equipped with an Intel Core i9-10900K, the Core i9 that's faster for gaming, 16GB of dual-channel DDR4 3600 memory, and an NVIDIA GeForce RTX 3080 graphics card. This allows us to run these games at 4K for the highest possible visual quality in today's video, while still being GPU bottlenecked in most of our configurations, which is really what we're after in this investigation. This sort of data has held up pretty well as a guide for other systems in the past, though of course, we'll point out situations where that may not be the case as we move through the results. I should also note quickly that we're just sticking to the presets on offer in the games we've tested, so that means we're not really factoring in ray tracing, DLSS, FSR, or any other additional features because these don't form part of the presets in, well, basically every game. This isn't about turning off ray tracing to get big performance improvements, most people know that already. This is more about the regular presets on offer. Watch Dogs Legion is the first game on the menu today, and it has 3 upper quality presets. We've got Ultra, Very High, and High. The differences between Ultra and Very High mostly concern level of detail and draw distances. For example, in this scene, you can spot the underground sign and some of the surrounding windows dropping a bit in quality between the 2 presets. Stepping down to High further reduces level of detail, but the quality of lighting throughout the scene is honestly very similar. In this second scene, I was able to spot a few small changes to shadow quality and texture quality between the 3 presets as well, though of course you can usually turn textures back up with next to no performance loss, provided you have enough VRAM. And here in this night scene, I found it quite difficult to spot the differences, aside from some minor adjustments to draw distance, as even the high settings are still preserving important visual quality offerings like reflections on the water and decent model quality. The key thing here is that dropping from Ultra even just to Very High sees a 29% improvement to performance, which I think is well worth it for a small hit to draw distance and shadows that isn't very noticeable while gaming. That can be further improved to a 47% increase when comparing High to Ultra, which really for most gamers is going to be the sweet spot considering the visual experience in Watch Dogs is still excellent in this mode, but performance is far higher. The differences in Assassin's Creed Valhalla are even smaller between the top 3 presets: Ultra High, Very High, and High. Switching down from Ultra to Very High produces, in my opinion, a rather negligible difference, mostly in far draw distance, which is very hard to spot when actually gaming or even when making these comparisons. The differences in shadow quality, reflections, lighting, textures, and really most of the important stuff is virtually unchanged between the top 2 settings. In fact, in this benchmark pass, the most noticeable differences are slight changes to time of day and the position of clouds, rather than actual changes in visual settings. Then when you throw high settings into the mix, it again presents only a small visual downgrade from either the Very High or Ultra High presets. Draw distances are further affected, and shadows have become softer, and we're not getting as many small shrubs in the environment, but the overall visual presentation really is still quite similar. We're certainly not losing major effects like ambient occlusion or reflections when switching to High, which is responsible for a lot of the great visuals. And the performance benefits here are decent, though not as large as in Watch Dogs Legion. Moving from Ultra High to Very High saw a 9% performance increase, and that improved to 14% when moving to High instead. Given that the differences between ultra and very high are so small, that's basically free performance being left on the table for most gamers. And in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, I certainly wouldn't recommend anyone simply enable the ultra settings without first playing on very high or even high. Cyberpunk 2077 is a visually stunning game and one of the best looking titles this generation, but the ultra settings are very punishing on today's hardware without using settings like DLSS. And in this game, the differences between the ultra and high presets are genuinely tiny, with ultra enabling a lot of effects that very slightly improve the visual presentation at a big hit to performance. For example, you'll be pretty hard pressed to spot any differences between ultra and high in this scene. Maybe a few small changes to shadowing, but actually the biggest change appears to be in the sharpness of content around the edges. Ultra enables chromatic aberration while high leaves this setting disabled, and therefore it's actually the high mode that has greater clarity around the edge of the screen. Some people may actually prefer how the high preset looks, despite ultra being the higher and supposedly more visually intensive mode. I was also able to spot some tiny differences in reflection quality in a scene like this. We're just using regular screen space reflections here, and the Ultra preset has a very slightly higher reflection resolution and quality, but again, most of the differences are negligible. In another scene here, we see small changes to shadow quality and ambient occlusion, but I'm not sure you'd actually be able to spot these differences straight away if I wasn't pointing them out to you. Texture filtering is another area that has received a minor visual downgrade moving from ultra to high, but even at 4K, the high mode still looks great for texture clarity. And the big kicker here is the performance uplift. In our benchmark pass, using the high preset instead of ultra delivered a 24% increase to performance, which is basically for free, given the incredibly small visual differences. In Cyberpunk, the ultra preset really is very dumb, and most gamers should not be using it instead of high, given that sort of performance delta. Hitman 3 has no presets, so in this game I'm comparing the settings labelled Ultra to the settings labelled High. This is another title where I found it extremely difficult to spot the differences between using these settings. The game is telling me that High is reducing level of detail, shadows and ambient occlusion, but in practice the differences are negligible with only a tiny change to shadow detail or draw distance seen in practice. It's certainly not the sort of difference you will actually notice while playing the game most of the time, as Hitman 3's stunning reflections and other visuals are still preserved regardless of what option you choose. As only a few settings are changed between Ultra and High, the performance difference is also small, just a 5% improvement in this case. I still think this is worth it given the virtually unnoticeable visual downgrade, but it's not the earth-shattering improvement that will take an unplayable experience and make it playable. Not every game chooses to go all out with Ultra settings. In Dirt 5, here we have some side-by-side footage of the game running using the Ultra High preset and the High preset. Now, I really tried to find the differences between these two benchmark passes, but found it incredibly difficult watching the races in motion. I think there are some slight improvements to reflections, shadow and terrain quality in the ultra high image, but for the most part the images are virtually identical and are especially identical in the motion of a race. There may be some things I'm missing here, but I checked a few other scenarios and really I just can't identify much of a difference, similar to what we were looking at in Hitman 3. Unlike in Hitman though, there is actually quite a substantial performance difference between the ultra high and high presets, which is a bit baffling to me and indicates that codemasters must be going really over the top with minor upgrades when you enable ultra high. It's a straightforward 17% performance improvement using high over the maximum preset for virtually no change to visuals, so this is a total no-brainer. Gamers should be using the high preset in this game and just forgetting about ultra. Doom Eternal has 4 presets in the higher range. We have Ultra Nightmare, Nightmare, Ultra, and High. The differences between Ultra Nightmare and even down to Ultra, so a 2-spot reduction in the graphics preset, they're pretty tiny. I noticed some very small changes to ambient occlusion quality for distant objects, and that's about it really. Almost everything else in the scenes I checked was unchanged, including the quality of reflections, models, volumetrics, and so on. Ultra Nightmare in Doom Eternal is really like an extreme preset in other games that doesn't do much to the visual experience. There is a more noticeable change between High and the Ultra presets though. There's a more pronounced change to lighting and the way lights interact with some surface materials. Ultra has a more natural look while High is a bit reduced in that regard. With that said, High still looks very good and nothing much is sacrificed in terms of environment quality or level of detail. Doom Eternal is an interesting case on the performance side from the perspective that generally the game runs, well, really well on a variety of hardware, so I'm not sure there is much of an incentive to reduce visuals. With that said, Ultra Nightmare isn't really worth using, as switching to Nightmare saw a 7% performance improvement in the area we tested. However, the difference between High and Ultra Nightmare is only a 10% improvement to frame rate, so with more noticeable differences in visuals, I think the balance with this game lies with either the Nightmare or Ultra modes, though once again the highest available preset isn't worth using. Days Gone is the big outlier in our testing today. There is the most substantial difference yet between the highest preset on offer, in this case very high, and the high preset. Turning down to high has a significant impact on the way the environment is shadowed and lit, affecting both ambient occlusion and shadow quality. A lot of shadows simply disappear when using high, and that causes the game world to look much flatter and less natural. With that said, there isn't much of an impact to draw distance or texture quality, which is good to see as it often makes sense to keep those settings on high quality levels if you have enough VRAM and a good enough CPU. With a moderately large visual difference between the very high and high presets, it's no surprise to see one of the largest performance differences we've encountered yet. A 33% performance improvement is significant, but while that's nice for more mid-range GPU owners, I don't think those with powerful GPUs will want to sacrifice visual quality in this way. Tweaking of the individual graphics options or just sticking to very high I think is the way to go in Days Gone. Deathloop is another example of a game where there isn't much of a visual difference between the highest three presets: Ultra, Very High, and High. In this scene, for example, there are small differences to draw distance for far objects and reflection quality between Ultra and Very High, but you'll be hard-pressed to notice this difference unless you're specifically looking for it. This scene is another example of that, where outside of a few small areas, nothing much changes, and again, it's great to see the high texture detail preserved regardless of your choice. Even using high settings doesn't degrade the visual quality that much compared to Ultra. There is a small change to how shadows work, particularly contact shadows, but the game still looks great using high settings. The most obvious difference was more in terrain quality in some scenes. I did spot an adjustment to what appears to be how tessellation works, but it doesn't necessarily make the game world look all that much worse, and most of the key features such as shadows and reflections remain at great quality levels. In Deathloop, I only recorded a minor performance improvement moving from Ultra to Very High, so these two modes are nearly equivalent. However, dropping from Ultra to High saw an 18% performance improvement, so that's a pretty easy uplift to achieve at a relatively minor cost to visuals. This might let you achieve a more consistent frame cap, which appears to be the way most people are playing Deathloop at the moment. The final game I'm looking at today is Microsoft Flight Simulator. This is still one of the most visually stunning games of today, and it looks spectacular whether you choose to run it at the Ultra preset or the step lower high-end preset. The major differences here are in draw distance, and I say major, but it's really a minor change depending on the environment. Ultra has longer draw distances with more objects loaded further into the distance, as well as a few minor improvements to things like cloud quality. However, I still think that High has generally very good draw distances with very similar detail on closer objects compared to Ultra. In fact, lots of areas are very similar between these modes, such as the quality of the plane model, reflections, shadows, and water quality. Ultra does provide that slight bump up in visuals and is great for extremely powerful rigs, but you shouldn't feel bad at all for running on high-end instead. I think high-end actually looks better than most other games out there today. And the performance upgrade on offer is rather significant, a 25% uplift in frame rate on the landing challenge at Sydney Airport with a high object load. Now, Flight Simulator can be quite CPU intensive depending on your hardware and the conditions, but when GPU limited testing at 4K like we are in this video, being able to go from 45 FPS to 57 FPS on average is pretty substantial to providing a smoother experience with a variable refresh display. So that's a look at the differences between the Ultra and the High presets across 9 games, most of which are quite visually impressive. In the majority of these titles, the visual reduction going from Ultra to High is small, with lots of key visual features still being used in the high mode, such as reflections, ambient occlusion, or high quality shadows. For the most part, the jump from High to Ultra is mostly about minor improvements to these features, like slightly sharper shadows, more accurate ambient occlusion, or commonly longer draw distances. This can often lead to High being very hard to distinguish from Ultra, especially when you're playing the games in motion. In fact, in games like Cyberpunk 2077, Hitman 3, and Dirt 5, choosing Ultra over High offers basically nothing other than a reduction to frame rate. Then in several more titles such as Flight Simulator, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and Deathloop, the differences are only noticeable if you really look for them. However, that's not always the case, of course, as we showed in Days Gone, which had the largest difference between the presets. The performance improvement you get from simply switching from ultra to high is typically in the range of 15 to 25%, which is nothing to scoff at. With such limited improvements to visuals, that does make the ultra presets in a lot of these games kinda dumb. Choosing ultra is punishing your hardware for not a great deal in return. In fact, in only one of these games would I say the highest preset offers the best optimized experience. If the balance of visuals and performance matters to you at all, high is the place to be. The point of making this video is to cover a few things really, and the first is that I think PC gamers should shift away from thinking of ultra settings as the obvious go-to choice for PC gaming. All the talk is about playing on ultra and needing hardware to play on ultra when really, high settings are just fine. Ultra is often a waste of time and can lead to complaints of a game being poorly optimized. I don't think a game that is punishing on ultra but looks virtually the same on high and performs much better should be classed as poorly optimized. That's more an issue of perceiving ultra as the only way to play a game on PC when that is far from the case. Of course, there are some games that are poorly optimized, and there are plenty that don't have the best presets and will unnecessarily drop texture quality even when using the high mode. But for the most part, I think we should be more willing to try out the presets below the highest when gaming on PC, as the experience is often better, or at least better in terms of a balance between visuals and performance. The second really important point is that if you shift away from thinking of ultra as the only settings worth using, or that you need to play on ultra or you're missing out, then upgrading your PC becomes a less daunting task. High settings are more playable on a wider range of hardware, and if high is your target, then maybe you don't need that RTX 3080 or RX 6800 XT. This sort of thinking will actually save you money, which is especially crucial in today's climate where an RTX 3080 costs you like $1 million. Optimizing for what you have and what actually gives the best cost to experience ratio is always a good approach to take, and in most games that means settling for high settings. While I'd strongly recommend gamers use high settings instead of ultra in most games, there are still some reasons to use ultra settings. Benchmarking GPUs is one of them. Using ultra places the most stress on the GPU, it will lead to fewer CPU or other system bottlenecks, and that's the best practice for reviewing hardware. We'll still be using ultra settings in a lot of our benchmarks for that reason. It can also make sense to use higher quality presets when you face other limitations. If you're CPU limited, for example, raising quality settings can often come at no hit to performance, which is always a nice thing. Similarly, if a game is hitting the refresh rate ceiling of your monitor and you're playing with VSync or frame rate limits enabled to prevent tearing, that's another opportunity to raise visual quality at no loss to performance. And finally, there are just some games where frame rate maybe isn't that important. You have powerful enough hardware and you just want to experience the best visuals the game has to offer. Slow-paced single-player games are a perfect example of this, where maybe you don't need an extra 20 FPS if you're already playing at 120 FPS. But I think it's important to be aware that in these cases, the actual benefit from using ultra may not be as high as you thought, and I hope that this video has kind of highlighted that particular issue. Anyway, that's it for this settings comparison video. Kind of explains a little bit as well to why we don't really do optimization videos as much anymore. A lot of the time it's just, turn the settings down to high and then you've got basically the best experience possible. So yeah, I think that's pretty good advice for most gamers, and with a number of AAA titles coming up very soon, I think you can take this advice and use that for those games as well to get the best possible experience. We might come back also and assess the medium quality settings in a future video update, because that's going to be the most suitable for GPUs like say an RX 580 or GTX 1060. So we'll take a look at how that compares to Ultra if there's enough interest in something like that. As always, if you want to support our testing, we do have our Float Plane and Patreon accounts. Links to those are in the description below if you want access to things like our Discord chat and monthly live streams. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.